We're going to make a start processing our rhythm section here, and the first thing I'm going to look at is the piano. Now, we're not doing an awful lot here on the EQ, we're just using a little high pass to keep the low notes out the way of the bass, and we're using a low pass to soften up the top. It's also worth mentioning we are actually already tonally shaping the piano because it's going into our rhythm stem, which is being EQ'd to have a lot more sort of upper mids and trebles. So we set that up in episode 4, just thought I'd mention that. Next up inside of our virtual mix rack, we have the VCC in Hollywood, which is just going to start adding some fullness to the piano track. In keeping with our mix bus, we are sticking with the Brit 4KE. I chose the Hollywood preamp because it has the brightest harmonic generation compared to the other virtual preamps we could have picked. This type of distortion will lend itself well to the style of mixing that we're going for. For some subtle compression, we're using the FG Stress with a slow attack, fast release, 3:1 ratio, 80% mix, with distortion 2 checked to add some more thickening to the piano track. Finally, the high pass detector is on. We're using this to avoid the compressor grabbing at the signal too much during any parts where more low notes are being played. You can hear the FG Stress has given us some nice bite on the piano part. This is due to the compressor being set to the slowest attack setting, allowing the initial attack to go through with little compression, and then it's clamping down on that sustain part of the sound. The next compressor we're using is the Custom Opto. This compressor is going to serve two purposes. Firstly, it's going to smooth out the amount of bite that we're getting from the first one, so it's just going to smooth out a little. And then secondly, we're also utilising it as a saturator. What we've done is we've set the tone knob to warm, and then we're driving that intensity up to 200%. So here I would say the main theme for the piano is we're trying to thicken it up as much as possible with all of these different types of distortions that we have available to us. Take a listen and see what you think. Now to finish off with the piano, let's do some A-Bs of the entire track process. First we'll do in solo, and then in context. The reason the harmonic thickening and compression is so important in this case is because the track is fairly dense with a lot going on, and the piano is only supposed to sit kind of not in the foreground but behind the foreground. I wouldn't say the background, but it's not one of the main themes of the mix. Now, we want to make it so it doesn't get completely lost, and a lot of harmonic thickening was used along with compression to help anchor the piano so we don't just hear the initial attack, but also get some of the sustain coming through. If we didn't do this, what would happen is the piano would be played, and you'd get that little part of the bite sound, the initial attack would come through, and then as it decays, it would go underneath sort of the threshold of hearing, and you would lose a lot of detail. Right, now I want to show you what we're doing with the synth pad on the intro. Here we're simply automating up the volume to get a nice slow swell for the beginning of the track. This is accompanied with some automation on the low pass of the EQ. So essentially the sound evolves during the intro. This is important for making the sound more interesting as it starts very low fidelity and it starts to open up. And what this does is it creates a sense of tension, which will hopefully grip people when they're listening to the track and make it so they stick around for the next part, which is coming up. The next thing we wanted to do with the synth is essentially get out of the track as transparently as possible, and here we use more automation on the high pass, this time in the opposite direction. So we are making the sound lower fidelity, which subtly pushes the synth more to the background before we completely automate the volume fade down before the main section. For the saturation, I'm not overthinking this too much. Again, it's just a case of adding some more thickness, and the type of saturation we're using here is in keeping with the rest of the track. And for the acoustic, we use the virtual microphone system. So I decided to use the FG800 microphone model because of its inherent brightness mainly. It was perfect for bringing out the top end detail of each pick hitting the string on each drum. We then go into our virtual channel using the 4KE model once again, which is accompanied with the Hollywood virtual preamp. Since the acoustic was captured going straight into a clean condenser mic with a neutral preamp, it is important to build in some of that musical thickness you miss out on when you're working entirely in the box. As you add small amounts of saturation to each track, they will build up and have a large effect by the time it hits the mix bus. For the compression, we're using the 401, getting around 6 dB of gain reduction on the louder sections. We're using a slow attack, a fairly quick release, and a ratio of 3. And ultimately, what we're just trying to do is just get a little bit more dynamic consistency from section to section. Now let's take a listen to what we're doing with the EQ. As you can hear, the main objective was to thin out the acoustic by using the high pass up to around the 200 Hz area. And we're also using that low shelf, which is further attenuating the low mids. Now, in isolation, it doesn't sound that great, but as you'll hear later on, it cleans up the lows to allow the low pitched percussion and bass to exist in that area without any fighting for attention. Now, for me personally, this is not how I would usually mix. Usually what I would do is I would high pass up to the rumble and I would leave the lower mids, and how I would treat the lower mids and those bass notes is with a low shelf, and I would set that in such a way that it kind of has a handshake with the second order and third order harmonics of the bass. That's how I would usually do it. But for this style, we need a well-defined low end. And this style of EQ where you just high pass up to 200 Hz is an effective way of achieving that. Obviously, listen and make your judgments in the context of the mix. It may sound too thin in isolation, but with the bass and low pitch percussion, you'll most likely find you don't notice. Here I'm just showing you the differences of EQ of all of the stringed instruments. I won't bother going through what's happening on the virtual mix rack because it's the same as the guitar, except we didn't need a compressor to control the dynamics. On the banjo and mandolin, we're high passing up again to keep the low end tight and controlled, but this time we're actually adding some weight back into the low mids with the low shelf there. Take a listen to all of them together and hear how they're balanced. Because each of these stringed instruments have fairly different timbres, they naturally have a very good stereo spread, which leads me on to a little trick I'd like to share with you. When we set up our panning in episode 2, we originally had all of our stringed instruments hard panned left and right. It sounded wide, but personally, I wanted it to sound wider. Now what we're going to do is something called panning outside of the speakers. The easiest way to do this, I found, is with a stereo enhancer, but we have a problem. Stereo enhancers have their quirks and can smear the stereo image in a way which, in my opinion, doesn't sound good. Now I'm going to show you a way to get around that. What I do is I actually bring the panning of the acoustic guitar and the banjo and mandolin in from hard panned to only panned 80%. Now this might sound counterintuitive to getting a wider sound, but what we're doing is we are prepping the instruments for our stem track called stringed, where there we have the stereo enhancer waiting for the panned instruments. So by bringing in the width, we are trying to avoid a lot of the nasty stereo smearing you will usually get from a stereo enhancer. Now, stereo enhancers can be very simple, where all they do is they use mid-side techniques to simply increase the volume of the sides relative to the sensor. This one from Kilohertz is not that simple. It's also using psychoacoustic imaging techniques to make the sound appear wider, which in this case will result in the sound appearing to coming from, outside of the speakers. Explaining what psychoacoustic techniques are actually being used here is outside the scope of this lesson, and also I can't be sure exactly what's happening just by listening, so I don't want to speculate. What I will say is, a lot of the psychoacoustic stereo techniques can easily result in a smeared stereo image, and having hard panned instruments further pushed wide by a stereo enhancer exacerbates the issue. So I found keeping the material panned slightly more central, say 80% like we have here, and then using a stereo enhancer to bring that width back was the best way to achieve the outside of the speakers panned sound. Take a listen and see what you think. Now that you've heard the results, what I want to do is I want to demonstrate the issue I'm talking about here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what happens when you hard pan the tracks and then use a stereo enhancer. Take a listen to the issues we run into. To me, the stereo image has much more defined positionality when you underpan and then utilize the enhancer to get that width back. Experiment with it yourself and listen carefully and see what you think. To tie everything up here on our stringed section, we're using the FGX to essentially level the peaks between the acoustic, the banjo, and the mandolin. Since all of our width is coming from this section, I wanted to anchor those peaks in such a way that it stops them from jumping out and making the stereo image lopsided. One thing to note is the ITP setting. We are using the most transient neutral form of limiting by setting that fader fully to hard. You can't actually do this on most material because anything with low bass notes will distort when limited. In this instance, we can do it because the instruments we're dealing with have no low end, especially after high passing the acoustic guitar. Here is the effect with the constant gain monitoring button on so that we can hear without any additional gain clouding our judgments. And that's everything for this lesson. Thanks for joining me. I'll catch you next time.